Berlin, Russia, 1976. Here begins the Travel Chronicle. Two folders in the William Saroyan paper at Stanford's Green Library caught my attention. They dealt with a journey Saroyan took from his part-time home in Fresno out through Los Angeles and London to Helsinki, Leningrad, Moscow, Yerevan, and finally, Athens. The folders is one of the most complete documents of any of his travels, and is one that is quite different from many of his other trips. On the first entry of this journal, dated Saturday, October 9, 1976, at 1:05 p.m., Saroyan describes his journey. I shall be gone for about 44 days from tomorrow, when, with Varsdat Samuelian, I fly at 9:25 a.m. United Air to Los Angeles, and around 11:30 by TWA, a non-stop over the pole to London, British Air around 11:30 Monday to Helsinki, overnight the next early evening to Leningrad, Astoria Hotel, and 2 days later to the Moscow Metropole Hotel, and a few days later to Yerevan, although it is spelled Yerevan in the International Timetable book Shirley Gormley at Gottschalk's discovered. The round-trip Fresno to Moscow was paid by American Express card, $886.70. This is one of the most detailed of all Saroyan's coverage of his travels, though even this is incomplete. We know his travels, as documented rather cryptically in the travel memorabilia portion of the William Saroyan papers, and he visited several other cities, including Odessa in Ukraine, though he does not mention that here in the first outline of the trip. Any trip into the Eastern Bloc at the time would have required extensive visas and permitting, though it's not like he would have not known, but he has chosen the sites that are most important to his image of his trip. Or, potentially, he simply had a lot in his mind. He documents his trip to Helsinki in a few simple paragraphs, one of which looks at the time in the at Heathrow Airport cafeteria. Now, I have had tea, again, and a cold, dirty Danish, and then wraps up with his brief time at Heathrow with the symbol line, 7:40 a.m., London. Lock it up again. That's good enough. Journals like this are fascinating for a number of reasons. They do a lot of important work for the researcher in that they are in the moment, providing a glimpse of the minutiae of that day-to-day. It gives a view of his travels as a travel log, but also confirms things that he himself later would contradict. While he collected artifacts from all of his travels, he often interpreted them incorrectly, or at least inaccurately, especially in regards to year and location. He barely mentions his flight from LA to London, but writes a portion about his time in the airport with Varaz. He also gives us a hint as to the reason for traveling so much. Research. What's your name? Aram Garglonian, he said, and that was also meant to be instructions for future usage to Varaz to stop mentioning that I am a writer and giving my name. I told Varaz, I can't learn anything from people if they know I'm a writer. Many have pointed out that Saroyan was a keen observer of human nature, and part of that was clearly his ability to actually be among humans. In America, he was one of the best-known Americans, but abroad, he could be far more anonymous. His coverage of Helsinki in his journal is somewhat lacking, but honestly, more focused on the time soaking in his hotel room's bathtub. He barely mentions some of the sites he visited, but he actually spends more time talking about his prior visits when he stayed in the Hotel Tourney and visited Jean Sibelius in 1935. He is frequently reflecting on his past, and at the age of 70, it's understandable. But inserting the asides in a travel journal might seem odd unless he was thinking that this could be the basis for another book, or perhaps a chapter in one. There is a significant amount of time writing about money and the cost of rooms at the Intercontinental for him and Varaz. Saroyan's journals are chock full of his complaints and fears about money, in both his private journals and published works like Not Dying. He followed up his time in Finland by crossing into the USSR and Leningrad. Much of his journaling in Leningrad is more poetic than that of his Helsinki coverage. What fun, what talk, what laughter, what jokes among the best people of the world. The anonymous Armenians in streets talking loud enough to be heard all over town. A boat ride up and down the Neva, and the Aurora, a majestic triumph of the people of Russia. So now to wash, and drink tea, and to get out to more historic and glorious places, the Winter Palace, the Hermitage, crowned with people, where we bought catalogs and cards and souvenirs all just fine. In Leningrad, he is a tourist, and the focus on Armenia and Armenians becomes obvious here. He took a trip to the Siege of Leningrad Memorial with Gevorg Misakian. He talks of visiting with the boys from Yerevan at his hotel and signing autographs for them. He went to get official portraits done with Levon Mogchan, an abbreviation for Mogadishian, and Razmig Dvoyan. He even acquired Armenian staples for his pre-flight meal. I have Armenian-style loaves of bakarash bread with cheese and roast lamb cold whenever I may want food. It should also be noted that the actual spelling and grammar have been cleaned up for presentation here. The word bakarash is interesting as it doesn't appear to be a regular Armenian bread style. The typical Armenian bread to be found in Russia in the 1970s would have been matnakash, a pulled bread, though it could also be referring to bagash. The fact he uses the word loaves would make makanash more likely, though certainly the spelling is closer to bagash. But it is possible that he was referring to any number of Armenian breads, like chorog. He clearly made an effort to seek out Armenianness in Leningrad. Whee! How sweet it is to be in Leningrad with the Armenian poets and professors and sculptors and painters, writers and taxi drivers, laborers and friends and strangers, and readers of books, photographs, and drunks, and all of them other good people. This is one of the most Saroyan-esque statements he could possibly write about his appreciation for the Armenian people. It is very much in line with so many of his works where he celebrates the everyman and their delightful times. It's a basis for many of his stories, not the least of which being The Time of Your Life. He makes nearly hourly updates while in Leningrad. These cover everything from his eating, sleeping, and bathing habits to interactions with the staff. He writes very little about Leningrad himself. His pieces tend to be very inward-facing, but he makes one interesting note at 8:11 on Thursday, October 14th. Well, the sun has peeked out, and the square with the ferocious horse is lit up. I know little of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, but even I am aware of Nick on his horse, officially named Monument to the All-Russian Emperor Nicholas I, situated on St. Isaac's Square. The statue was considered a marvel when it was unveiled in 1859. The statue is over 6 meters tall, and the ferocious horse and rider is supported by only 2 small points of contact, the horse's rear hoof. The statue would have been a powerful sight at the time, and is still considering to be one of the finest pieces of public art in Leningrad, and is still today in St. Petersburg. He also relates attempting to find Tchaikovsky's grave without success, at least somewhat understandable as it is more than an hour's walk across the city. Another interesting note of the Leningrad portion of the journal, there is no mention of Varaz Samuelian by name. He concludes his coverage of Leningrad with this: 2:05 p.m. This is it then for Leningrad, and good enough. The jewel of the Byzantine church being restored was shut tight, so we weren't able to find out anything about it. We had a tea lunch, very good, at a small, almost basement establishment with caviar and such. And talks, so then we visited a very busy bookstore, where I chose 3 miscellaneous books in English. And now we lock up and go forthwith. While we are not certain the we in that passage is Varaz, it does seem likely, and Varaz does cover the trip in his book, William Varaz, though many things about his account do not quite jibe with Saroyan's account at the moment. For the first thing, he says the trip began on September 28th, when Saroyan has not only clearly dated and time-stamped each entry, but the passport stamps and hotel receipts all follow Saroyan's timeline. He writes the names of those Armenians they visited as Levon Merchkian and Razmik Dvoyan. Levon's name is accurate as written by Varaz, though Dvoyan is the preferred spelling for the poet. It's also interesting that Saroyan talks about going through the airport and flying to Moscow, while Varaz says they took a train. Saroyan settled into the National Hotel in Moscow for several days. He had stayed there on other visits to Moscow, and again instantly made contact with the city's Armenians. Here, there's another mention of Mukchan, and visiting an Armenian restaurant for double tea with Albert Kasparian. Here, Varaz Samuelian's name returned to the narrative on the trip as well. Again, Saroyan brings up his previous visits in 1960 when he stayed at the National Hotel. And as is typical of his journals on his travels, he complains about the $80 a night rate for the room at the National. He had stayed there before in 1960 and appears to think at this point it's hardly worth the expense. He also first mentions Intourist in this portion of his journal. Intourist was the primary travel authority for the Soviet Union from its founding in 1929. It began selling tour packages in the 1950s, and Saroyan took several package tours, and had planned and priced out several others over the course of the 60s and 70s. His first trip in 1935 had been enabled through Intourist. Intourist was not only a way to allow foreign visitors to experience the USSR, but as a way for the KGB to get a look at foreign visitors themselves and provide them with a positive experience of the Soviet Union. This meant keeping tourists in specific areas to not expose any negative aspects of Soviet life. was also seen as a way to bring hard currency into the USSR's coffers to allow it to purchase materials from the West. During the Moscow portion of the visit, Saroyan sees the finer things of the city has to offer. He enjoyed tea lunches almost every day, often with caviar and other fine foods. He is visited by friends who show him the best of the city. He expresses annoyance at the near constant phone calls from admirers, as well as members of Varaz Samuelyan's large family. Varaz has moved to the Rosoya Hotel, at the time the largest hotel in the world. Less than a year later, there would be a major fire in the Rossiya, killing more than 40 people. The Moscow portion of the journal ends on October 17, 1976, as he prepares to leave for the airport. And so here we start pretty much a new chapter of the travels of the fall of 1946, the Armenian phase. The least useful was the London phase, because we were required to spend 5 hours in a dreary waiting room. But after that, it has been sensible enough at that. I'll proceed now with my packing so that I shall be pretty much ready to go at 11 o'clock. Photograph with Aitmatov, both out front here somewhere and in the studio apparently. The final dispatch from Moscow is incredibly simple. 10:50 a.m. Now I lock it up. What is clear from this portion of his journal is that Armenia, and perhaps more accurately Armenians, were the point of this entire trip. Meeting with Armenians all along the way, he only bookended his goal with necessary buffer to the rest of the world. Travel to Armenia was not easy at that time, but Saroyan's determination to make the journey and likely to revisit the sites of his previous trips made a longer visit a requirement. While other extended journals from travel were clearly created with publication in mind, it's difficult to tell if this was his plan for these pages. While he certainly could have used these entries as material for a new book, it's also not clear that they're more than about recording his seemingly mundane interactions, or not. Still, Saroyan cannot help but write with his expected grace and style. While he clearly isn't editing these pages, he was still putting out an incredible amount of effort into documenting his travels. Almost makes you wonder if he had time to actually enjoy any of the sights. This has been from the collection of Forever Saroyan. I'm Chris Garcia. Thanks for listening.